Today we're talking about Chapter 8, Adapting Communication to Culture and Social Communities. So let's start off by talking about what is culture. According to Wood on page 157, culture is a way of life, a system of ideas, values, beliefs, customs, and language passed from one generation to the next and that reflects and sustains a particular way of life. So let's talk about the crucial pieces going on here. It's a way of life, so it's how we live. This is what we think, what we feel, what we believe, what's important to us, how we do things, what are our traditions, what is our language, how do we speak, right? And so we talk about how they're passed from one generation to the next, and that's important because culture is learned. It's not something that we genetically inherit. It doesn't occur naturally in the sense of, oh, we naturally do these traditions, we naturally believe these things. Those are things learned from the others in our communities. And then what happens is culture, this way of life, this way of being, it's developed in a way that it reflects and it sustains, this is our way of life. This is what we believe in the world. This is what we believe our relationship to the world is. And so across the world, we have a huge range of culture. It's also important to note that even while we talk about U.S. culture, there are multiple cultures and social communities within a nation. And so even though we have a dominant U.S. culture, the U.S. in particular is a nation of immigrants, and so we have so many communities within the nation that approach the world in very different ways. So cultural differences affect our communication in numerous ways, from our gestures and our greetings all the way to our values. And communication is an indicator of our culture. So there are several ways that we can look at culture. One we call ethnocentrism, and this is the thing that says our version is the best. Right? So if we think back to a previous chapter, think back to our perceptions of others, how we organize and understand others, and the stereotypes that we hold, ethnocentrism says what we do is best, everyone else is inferior. And so we have these negative stereotypes, these negative understandings of other ways of doing things. Cultural relativism in comparison is the idea that says all difference is good. All cultural differences, however you want to do it, is good. You should be able to. Just because we're different doesn't matter, right? Everyone's should be accepted. And then some folks came along and said, okay, difference is good, and we want a range of cultures, but there are some things that go against human rights that are not ethical. And so multiculturalism, as we'll look at it for the text, says, yes, you want difference, but it has to be within the constraints of ethics and human rights. So for instance, there are cultures that still practice femicide, which is either aborting or killing female children because boys are more valued. And if they don't have the resources to support multiple children, then they'll keep the boy and get rid of the girl in order to give more resources to the boy, right? That's still practiced in cultures. Female genital mutilation in various different levels is still practiced. We have a huge range of human rights violations that are very culturally based and that folks are trying to shift, but it's important to note here that cultural relativism doesn't acknowledge that those are violations of human rights. Instead, it says whatever difference is good, whereas multiculturalism came in that perspective and said, no, within limits, right? Within those limits of ethics. So if we go back to ethnocentrism, I have a quick example for you. The world according to Americans, and in this case, Americans refers to the U.S., so we can see that because we see America, we're number one, right? So we've got more America, U.S. flag. And if you read through some of the map of the rest of the world, you see some very negative stereotypes. Some are entertaining and some really express very ethnocentric perspectives of how the U.S., many people in the U.S. think about others, right? So Australia is kangaroos, the approximate Middle East, apparently bombs go there, it's full of evildoers. China and Russia-ish are all communists. Africa doesn't even exist, right? So very ethnocentric view of what the world looks like. So one of the things I'm going to focus on is called standpoint theory. This comes up in the chapter, it does get covered, and it's worth expanding on a bit because it affects how we perceive the world. So standpoint theory is what it sounds like. It says, based on where I'm standing in life, in my identity, I have a different perspective on the world and on social relations within it, right? So if we think about standpoint, vision, right? Here's my standpoint, here's what I can see. We're going to talk about that in relation to identities. So we have hierarchies within society. Depending what culture you're a part of, those are going to vary a little bit. In general, in the U.S., the dominant culture is European Anglo-men, the dominant race. Folks with more money are often more dominant. Being able-bodied, being able to fluently speak English, being relatively young, so, 20s, 30s, maybe into 40s, being heterosexual, even as we gain equal rights, both racially and across sexual identities, we still are geared towards a heterosexual society, and we still have inequalities between men and women, with men still earning more and having more social power. So this is just a few of the classifications of identity that people experience. So the idea here is that those folks who align more closely with the more dominant aspects of identity are more and more at the center of things, right? As opposed to people who are on the margins. So, right, if you're not part of the dominant group, or not all of your identities of the dominant group, you move further and further out on the margins. Ideology, this term that shows up in the middle, says that the way our culture, the way our nation thinks about the world, sets up the world, values what's in the world, usually unspoken, those are ideologies. These are the things that we believe that are just so ingrained in society that we often don't step back and think about them. If you're taking a liberal arts class in college, you probably do step back and think about them, but in general, as a culture, we don't talk about them much. So, standpoint theory says that if you're in the center in this more dominant group, you don't have to be very aware of what else is going on in the world, right? But as you move further and further and further out on the margins, you have to be aware of not only your position, but all of the dominant positions above you. And often that's for survival, right? You have to know how people in your culture interact versus how folks in a more dominant culture interact, because those in more dominant cultures affect those in marginalized cultures far more than it goes the other way. So what standpoint theory means is that you see the world in a different way because of your experiences in it and because of your culture's experiences in it, right? So the dominant group is often that's been in the power longest, and so has not had as many very negative experiences throughout history and culture kind of as a group, right? So I'm going to give you an example. It's a comedian, and he explains the situation, and I think gives a good example of how he, as a black man, sees the world and sees situations differently than some others might. So we're looking for how the margins have a different perspective on the center. And this is with Camel Bell, and his show is called Totally Biased.
Coming up. And as usual, we're more excited about the commercials in the game. And our friends over at Jezebel.com pointed out one commercial that's creating some controversy over maybe being a little bit racist.
No worries, man. Everything will be alright. Yeah! Wicked coffee, Mr. Jim.
Hey, Dave, you're from Minnesota, right?
Yes, the land of 10,000 lakes. The Gopher State.
Don't be no cloud on a sunny day.
Yeah, chill, Winston.
Sir?
Respect, bossman.
First of all, I am outraged because that white guy's fake Jamaican accent is way better than my fake Jamaican accent. Irie, blood clots, Haile Selassie. Okay, look, a white American dude doing the Jamaican accent, is that really racist? I don't know. Let's check in with America's preeminent authority on racism, Matt Lauer.
I thought if you buy this car, it puts you in a happy place. And what's happier than the memories we all have on being on beautiful islands on island time?
Oh, yeah, all of us have those memories. We all get to vacation on island time, Matt Lauer. Apparently, Matt Lauer only listens to the Bob Marley songs about weed and women and none of the songs about killing the white man. I mean, yeah, the ad is definitely culturally inappropriate, but I don't know if it's full-on racist. It's kind of like diet racism, you know what I mean? Or maybe diet racism with lime, which is actually horribly refreshing, yes. So, I mean, if I had to put it on my personal list of the most racist things of all time, it would be pretty far down. In fact, let's take a look at my list. Number 1, slavery. Number 2, slavery. Number 3, slavery. Actually, basically it's number 1 through 28, all slavery. Number 29, the movie Avatar. Then we go down the list, we go down the list. Number 325, it's that first season of Friends where they had a monkey instead of a black friend. You keep going down, keep going down. Yeah, we get the 1500s, every sitcom in the 80s where a black person was adopted by a white family. You keep going down, keep going down. Then we get somewhere like 3000, that Asian woman at the bakery who refuses to put change directly in my hand. Yeah. Keep going down, keep coming down. Here we get in the millions. And that commercial is right between C. Thomas Howell and Soul Man and that barber who freaked out when I sat down at Supercuts.
So, as you can tell, there's ways to be culturally insensitive, and I think he did a good job pointing out that different people perceive things in different ways, right? What some folks interpret as, this is just fun, it's my Halloween costume, others see as very offensive and culturally based, right? So, especially around Halloween, we see this happening. So we have folks, and quite a few different cultures have put out poster campaigns that say, this is not who I am, this is not okay, we're a culture, not a costume. And we see that especially with costumes of Native Americans, we see it with costumes of Arabs, we see it with costumes of Mexicans. So, for instance, you know, the Pancho Villa. No Doubt removed a brand new video that had come up because they were called out by Native communities for taking on symbols that were not theirs. Katy Perry caught backlash for taking on Japanese culture. A lot of sports figures, we get these conversations about these are old racist images, you know, why are we still using them? The argument that it doesn't have any meaning anymore doesn't matter, right? So especially when we look recently at about South Carolina removing the Confederate flag, we see that those symbols do still have very important meaning for people. And we also have very disturbing folks who thought it was a good idea to have a Halloween costume being Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman who shot him. So a really broad range of what cultural insensitivity looks like. So we're going to talk about dimensions of cultural values, and these are ways that social communities and cultures vary, both in the way they approach the world and then their communication practices that come out of that. This is one of the more complex parts of the chapter, which is why I'm going over it here. I do give you some tables. Feel free to pause to take more notes. I'm not going to read over everything on the table because I feel like pausing is a bit more effective for you. So we're going to talk about how cultures fall on this continuum of being more collectivist and more individualistic. Some cultures have a higher level of uncertainty avoidance, while others have a low uncertainty avoidance. They have what we call high power distance versus low power distance. Feminine communication styles and masculine communication styles. And long-term orientation versus short-term orientation. So these are all dimensions of cultural values, and I want you to notice the arrows, that they go both directions. All of these are continuums. They're not all or nothing. Different nations and different cultures within those nations can fall anywhere on these continuums. Often, if a nation is individualistic, you're more likely to be associated with some of these other aspects than you are these ones, but we have such a range of cultures across the world, we do get a pretty broad mix across all of these. The other piece we're going to talk about is how some places have a high context communication style and others have a low context communication style. So, cultural values. Let's talk about what it means to be collective versus individualistic. Collective, your concern is for the collective, is for the collection of people, is for the group. And you often pull your identity from your group membership. Where do you fit within the group? What generation are you? Who are you related to? Who are they? What have they done? And so collectivist communities, if you're far more collectivist, then you're likely far more affected by what your relatives do in society than just yourself, right? The opposite end of this is individualistic, and this is a focus on yourself. So the US is very, very individualistic. We have this theory that says if you aren't succeeding, it's because of yourself, because you didn't work hard enough, right? So the focus is on the self. This sometimes does ignore social aspects that keep people from succeeding, but the bootstraps ideology says if you're not succeeding in the US, it's because you as an individual are holding yourself down, right? Collective says you are a member of the group. You should not be standing out. You should be trying to advance the cause of the group, not trying to separate yourself from the group. So those are very different perspectives. When we talk about high and low uncertainty avoidance, a high uncertainty avoidance says you prefer to know what's coming. There are more social rules, so we've talked about norms and rules. And so there's a higher number of those because there are very specific expectations that says this is how you do this thing. There's this one way to do this, right? And there's an increased expectation among the culture that says here's how you do this piece. Here's how you enjoy a dinner. Here's how you go about this tradition. Right. It is worth noting that just because there are these extra rules for doing that, there's a special note that says just because these more rules exist doesn't necessarily mean the culture actually follows through on those rules, depending on the other aspects of their continuum or their cultural dimensions, which I recognize can get confusing. Low uncertainty avoidance, these are cultures that are more okay with ambiguity. So there are fewer social rules. For instance, these cultures often have a more entrepreneurial spirit where you can set out on your own and try these new companies, far more so than the high uncertainty avoidance. Because high uncertainty avoidance is starting at your own company, there's a lot of risk there. And so it's not as common if you're in a high uncertainty avoidance. Power distance. If you have a low power distance, think about this as a horizontal power distance, as in the sense of we're all on the same level, right? We're generally are equal, right? This is what's more often followed in the US, right? In the US, again, we have the bootstraps ideology that says if you start in the mailroom, you can work your way up to CEO. You just have to work hard enough because everybody's equal. We talk about the presidency and we say anybody can be president. And that is a very low power distance ideology. All right, so what you think about here for low power distance is you think we're all on the same level, it's this horizontal power structure, and so there's very low distance between people in the top of power and the people in bottom of power. Compare that to high power distance, and this is a very vertical power structure. And this says there's very definitely a hierarchy. If you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, you are never going to be at the top because your place in the world is at the bottom, right? And the people at the top, they're at the top for a reason, right? And so power symbols are far more predominant, and then you're far less likely to get confrontation and assertiveness in this. So an example here are pilots, and particularly Korean pilots. There have been several issues over the years that there's been an accident on the runway with the plane, and they come to find out later that, say, the first officer, the co-pilot, knew that something was wrong. But because it's such a high power distance culture, they cannot directly challenge the captain because the captain is an authority. So for instance, instead, the first officer might say something like, when I've come to this airport before, we had to de-ice the wings twice because it was so difficult. They can't say, we need to de-ice the wings twice. Instead, they have to suggest this situation might be happening and then get the lead from the captain, who's the authority figure, to then make the actual suggestion or order that says, okay, we're going to de-ice the wings twice. You can't actually suggest it. So that's something that trainers are actually trying to shift for pilot culture. And they're doing the same thing in hospitals across the world. The U.S., they find very significantly that if nurses are allowed to question doctors and doctors are willing to listen, then rates of accidents within hospitals drop dramatically. However, many doctors who are trained in the I know all, I should not be questioned, especially do not question me in front of a patient, when that's the culture within a hospital, there are generally higher rates of medical accidents than when the entire staff is able to talk and communicate and question one another in order to make sure they're all on the same page and that the right decisions are being made. So again, low power distance, think horizontal power distance, we're all on the same level. High power distance, think vertical. There's a lot of distance between those in high power and those in low power. So there's a very distinct hierarchy. Cultural values. We have what we call masculine and feminine communication styles. And a very important note that I want to point out. This is not gender-based, it is not sex-based, it is not women naturally do these things, men naturally do these things. So these are cultural styles. Men and women learn their modes of interaction and their modes of communication from their societies and from their cultures. What are their social rules? How are they supposed to interact? And the terms feminine communication style and masculine communication style are ones that were assigned by Western researchers based on Western social gender norms. All right, so I want to make very clear that this is not genetic differences. So when we identify a country, a culture, a social community as having a more feminine communication style, this does not mean that they're girly. This does not mean they speak in a high voice, right? What it means is that they have different values and goals with their communication. There's more often an emphasis on the quality of life. There's more emphasis on interpersonal relationships, on aiming for collaboration and negotiation, and how can everybody come out ahead in this situation. Those cultures with a more masculine communication style, right? That style is used to define a type of communication that has more emphasis on success, however that's culturally defined. For instance, in the US, that's often defined by having a high-power job and a lot of income and various cars and houses and toys that demonstrate that, right? Which is very different for a lot of folks than emphasizing quality of life and relationships. So in the masculine communication style, far more assertive, ambitious, competitive, far more I will do whatever it takes to win, even or especially if that means you lose, and you're more likely to have direct conflict, right? And that confrontation as opposed to negotiation and collaboration. Long and short-term orientation, this cultural dimension is talking about how a culture thinks about time. So in a long-term orientation, we should really call this a future orientation. These are cultures that are focused on the future. They value persistence, and they can delay short-term gratification for long-term success because they value the long-term success more so than that short-term. Short-term orientation, we should really call this a past and present orientation because these are communities that are concerned with the past or concerned with the present. They do not think about the future in the same way. They don't really value, they value tradition and hierarchy and fulfilling social obligations. They value thinking about the past, honoring the hierarchy that's always been, rather than thinking about what's coming in the future and those future generations. Okay, so those are the cultural dimensions, and here I want to talk about the cultural value of having a high and low context communication. And this is going to sound confusing for a lot of folks. I find a lot of folks have trouble here, and they often mix up which one's high context and which one's low context. So I want you to remember that context means situation. Context is this is what's going on around me. These are the social rules. This are the expectations for this situation. So in a high context communication culture, right, this says high context, there is a lot of context happening here. There's a lot of expected rules, expected behaviors, expected knowledge about this situation, right? So because there are so many social expectations, you should have learned all of these things growing up, And therefore, we're not going to tell you anymore, right? Maybe when you're a kid, you get told or you learn from watching others, but then as you age, the expectation is that you know it. And you are supposed to gain so much information just from the context and the situation and the social rules that you don't need to ask, right? This is the idea that says, all right, we don't have our rules as written, we don't have as much formal communication because it's just passed down. It's handed down through generations, it's handed down through families, it's handed down through the collective. And so we just know this is what you do. On the other hand, those cultures that fall further on this low context end, remember it's not all or nothing, the low context end says, you know, we have so many different ways that we could do things and so many different meanings in every situation that there's no one right way. And so I'm going to need you to tell me, right? I've got this wedding invitation. What am I wearing? What time are we showing up, right? Where are you registered for gifts? Because depending on what culture you're a part of, those answers are going to be very different. So the US falls very far on this low context end of the scale because we have so many cultures that developed the nation that depending who you're hanging out with, depending who you're interacting with, they may be Polish or Irish or Mexican or Iranian or Kenyan or, Southern. However they grew up, wherever their families came from, there are likely different rules and expectations. And so we often have to ask, and there's going to be very specific rules for how we get along. So low context, the context does not give us much information, and so we very much need more explicit information, more explicit communication. Right? That's low context. The other end, high context, we get so much information from the context that it doesn't get spoken about a lot. You're just expected to know it, so there's less communication. Okay. So as we move forward, it's important to remember that cross-cultural communication competence is a process. Cultural adaptation is a process. Right? And so Wood talks about that often when people encounter cultures that they don't know about, there's a resistance, right? And they resist knowing about and becoming part of that culture. Just as a side note, the opposite of resistance, she calls surrendering. And that's when we have assimilation. Assimilation is the idea that you just totally give up your own culture and take on a new one. So for instance, the metaphor of the melting pot for the US is a metaphor that says everybody goes into the melting pot and comes out the same, which says everyone goes into the melting pot, gives up their own culture, and picks up a new one. They all assimilate to be the same way. And so when we talk about the melting pot metaphor, that's actually a metaphor of assimilation. And for that reason, more people are no longer using that metaphor to apply to the US. More often, people are using metaphors such as the US is like a garden salad, right? Where you have very different flavors, very different ingredients, but they all work together to complement one another, right? To create this good whole. Okay, so cultural adaptation, we have resistance to change. Then we have tolerance. Tolerance is you're just putting up with it, right? So tolerance is not actually a very positive thing. It really is just bare minimum after resistance. It's like, fine, it's there, whatever. I'll deal with it. Understanding is you try and understand more about other cultures. Respect is you gain that understanding and you start to respect the difference. You respect why the cultural differences are what they are and why people make the choices they do. And then last there is participation. You actually, take part in the culture. Right? And this can happen in a lot of different ways to a lot of different extents. For those of you who have spent extensive time traveling abroad or with other cultures, right, you start to see this more, such as, go and live in Chile for a year and you pick up some of the customs and you bring them back when you come back, right? So the other thing to remember about cross-cultural communication competence is adaptation is a process, but then you need to think about why do we need it? And I want you to look into the chapter here for this. Why do we need it? And think big picture. How is it going to help you get along in the world if you have a competence in cross-cultural communication? And I want you to think about how do we attain it? And so Wood touches on that we must respect others, that we try and reduce our uncertainty. So she talks about the uncertainty reduction theory. And this is the idea really that we learn about others, we're open to learning about others, and we increase the number of schemas that we have in order to understand and interpret situations. And then she also discusses how we need to be open to change, open to difference. And a really crucial step of that is avoiding ethnocentrism and stereotyping. So spend some more time in the chapter with what each of these mean, and be comfortable kind of how might I apply that? How does that apply in my life? And finally, if you haven't seen it, I really recommend the movie Gran Torino to demonstrate cross-cultural communication and the process of cross-cultural competence. I will warn you that there's a lot of foul language and racism within the film, but that gradually changes across the course of the film as Clint Eastwood, as you can see on the cover, he's an old Korean war vet who his wife has just died, and he is living in a neighborhood in Detroit that is now full of Hmong families. And how do they interact? Kind of what are the social circumstances around that? So if you take a look under additional resources, I've laid out some clips for you that demonstrate some of the concepts that we've talked about. And I've also included some clips for a documentary that's included at the end of the movie, which is actually featuring the Hmong actors who take part in the movie. And they talk about how important having a mainstream movie about their community was for their culture, and how it really raised awareness about the social problems that have happened with them as refugees after the Vietnam War and now, right, as immigrants and multi-generational families within the U.S. So there's lots of examples of cross-cultural communication. I've paired the perception chapter and the cross-cultural chapter because these two concepts are so related. And as we move forward throughout the rest of the quarter and semester, it's really crucial that you think about cultural difference, that you think about identity differences, and how those are going to affect people's interactions